talking about the history of political parties. Judy comes to us as both a part-time instructor at both COCC for the last 10 years and OSU Cascades since 2015 in political science. She also is a former Oregon State representative from 2009 to 2011 when she served on about a handful of different committees and subcommittees. She also is the former program director and in-house legal counsel for CASA of Central Oregon. In addition, Judy, when she entered law school in the mid-70s, was entering a class of law students that had about 20% women. And at this point, there's 50% or
over 50%.
Yes.
Over 50% of most law school classes are women.
Right. So I really appreciate these women who are on the vanguard of helping achieve parity in law and other professions where women really hadn't been well represented. But I would like to introduce or welcome Judy at this point.
Thank you very much. The pressure is on. I'm going to stick this over here so I don't get anything, I am not very technologically, how would you put it? What's that? Sophisticated. Yeah, there you go. I like that. I call my son a lot my son runs the Space Systems Program for General Atomics out in Colorado. I'm like, where the hell did you come from? Not your father and I, that's for sure. But I'm happy to be here. Always enjoy doing things and interacting with the league. It's always a kick in the britches, so to speak. And I will tell you up front here that you're probably going to feel like one of my poli-sci classes. So what can I say? When we talk about the history of something like political parties, you could get really deep in the weeds. But I'm going to try to sort of make it relatable. That's my big goal. So, and excuse me here a minute. The allergy season is getting to me. So at any rate, feel free to ask questions, and I am focusing on political parties in the United States. That's my main focus here, because it could get really, like I said, very much out there. It would be at least half of a course if I was to wander around the whole world. But first I wanted to talk about what the definition of a short definition of political parties would be: a group of persons organized to acquire and exercise political power. A more encompassing definition is one that I ran across years ago when I was doing some stuff for one of my classes. It was by a person named Anson Morris, who was a mid to late 19th century academic here in the United States. And he described a political party as a durable organization united by common principles, which has for its immediate end the advancement of the interests and the realization of the ideals of a particular group or groups which it represents. So a little bit more, it like I said, the short definition is a group of people organized to acquire and exercise political power, but I think that definition really does sort of grasp the true essence of what political parties were designed to be, quite frankly. So going back historically just a little bit, first of all, the word politics comes from the Greek word politikos, P-O-L-I-T-I-K-O-S, which means of, for, or relating to citizens. So keep that in mind. As I emphasize, the classes I teach at OSU and COCC, I teach Intro to U.S. Government and Politics, and then I teach state and local government. And one of the things I always try to emphasize to them, politics has come to effectively, in some respects, be sort of a dirty word. That's how I would say probably the common, ordinary, everyday citizen views it. It's not in a positive way necessarily, but the originations of the term really talk about the people. That's what it's about. That's what it's designed to be about. So always keep that in mind. Now, the existence of organizations or groups, and I think probably the better way to refer to them is a people, forming groups or factions to advocate for their shared interests, goes way back to ancient Greek and Roman times. If you look through the data in the history back there, as particularly, in the Greek times, there were, Aristotle talked about politics. He had I guess you would call it a sort of an essay that he wrote about it. So it was that idea of people, getting together to have their voices heard was something that goes back to those eras. Those were, and in the Roman times, like the Roman Republic, that was sort of the active birth of political parties in this world. The existence of these groups sort of, continued to flow through times. And one of the probably strongest places where you had, not going back to ancient times, but in historical times where you had strong political parties or political organizations was in the Dutch Republic during the 15, 16, and 1700s. They had they had two primary parties that were, one was the Orange Party and the other was this very long name that I can't pronounce at any rate. But they were basically about 250 years. They were clashing to get power, to have influence, to sort of control the, how things were functioning, operating, how things were happening. So that was sort of, I think probably within what we look at as sort of more modern history, that was sort of one of the strongest and sort of the beginning of the political party movement, the organizational aspect of politics. And also in England, political parties started growing in the 1600s and early 1700s. They started really making a sort of a mark on society and how society was functioning, because those were during times when the monarchy was experiencing, it was ebbing and flowing, and its power was becoming a little bit more constricted by as more of a a non-monarchical government developed as well, with parliament and that kind of thing. So England was sort of a harbinger of the growth and birth, or I would say the growth of political parties as well. The origin of modern, more organized political parties arose in the late 18th century, so the late 1700s, both in Europe and here in the United States. So the rest of my talk is going to focus on here in the United States and how sort of things came about. One of the things, I think we all probably think that political parties existed forever in this country. And they were the end all and be all when it came to how things happened and occurred, and how government functioned, but that's not the case. In fact, a lot of early Americans, particularly in the early to mid 1700s, really tried to avoid political parties and the development of political parties. They were not seen as necessarily a favorable entity in government and the operations of society. George Washington, in fact, though he was very sympathetic to many of the Federalist views, he won the presidency his 2 times without campaigning as a member of a political party. And during his tenure in the presidency, he remained very staunchly nonpartisan in his approach to carrying out the presidential work. And that's something a lot of people are like, oh wow, didn't know that. But yeah, if you go back and look at sort of the, the data sheet of the elections, and he has no party affiliation at all attached to him. So during the late 18th century, as the U.S. moved through the revolution and then into the processes of establishing an independent nation, views and positions on crucial issues diverged, and what happened was that leaders disagreed on how to approach different aspects of society and governance, and what direction should we go. And as a result, factions developed supporting certain positions, and we had the birth of political parties in this nation, and that's really the time. The first official political party in the United States was the Federalist Party, and it originated in the late 1780s. A lot of people go, wow, not until the 1780s. That's right. The Federalists were supported, they basically supported a strong national government. Any of you who've gone and read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton had this idea that for things to function and for things to function effectively for all, that there needed to be this sort of focal point of power, authority, and decision making. So their belief was that there needed to be this strong central government, that you couldn't have sort of this ripshod aspect to society out there, well, these people doing this and these people doing that, and not knowing where we were going and what we were going to do. So that was sort of their focus, and that's what they really pushed forward. Those who wanted to leave more power to the states and the local communities, for the most part, they formed a party in response to the Federalists, which was called the Democratic Republican Party, or was also referred to as the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Thomas Jefferson was very instrumental in forming that political faction, that organization, and had a lot of influence in that. So the development of these two parties set up what became the dominant organization of political parties in the United States, a two-party system. Now, I'll talk throughout this about the fact that we have other parties. But it became very apparent early on that we didn't want to develop the kind of political landscape that they had in some of the European countries, for instance, where you had multiple parties, and really you ended up having a lot of chaos in sort of the policy making and the political process. It just sort of naturally evolved into this two-party system, almost right from the beginning of the political parties here in the United States. And so with the development of this two-party system, it didn't mean that other parties didn't exist, or that they didn't have some aspect or some input into the political functions of government and of society. This idea of a two-party system defines how a party system evolved in this country. And a party system is an organization of political parties comprising the two main parties of any era, and they changed throughout, and we'll talk about that. And the coalitions of supporters backing each of these positions, particularly on major issues that were facing the country, and then each party's electoral achievements. So political parties are always evolving, and with that there are party system changes as well. Most political scientists agree that across US history we have had 6 distinctive party systems, which is an interesting little, oh, okay. So what I'm gonna do here then is jump into those 6, and those systems apply to various periods of time throughout our history, throughout the US history. So in the beginning, the first party system, which covered the era of around the late 1780s to the late 1820s. So from about 1788, 89 to 1828. And this was an era of rabid competition between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And I'll continue to refer to that party as the Democratic Republicans because, yeah, they were the Jeffersonian, but that's sort of the historical mantra that, label that got really attached to that organization. And this was an era that was underscored by activism of both parties in contesting elections and building coalitions. It was really an activist era in that regard. It's like when light bulbs went on and the organization said, what we really need to do is focus on getting our people in these various positions so that our ideas, our policies, the things we think we need for this government to function effectively, that they can get implemented. So that whole idea of that connection between the parties and the elected officials really sort of ramped up during this time. And it can be safely said that the Federalists pretty much dominated the political landscape until about 1800, when Thomas Jefferson was elected president. And both chambers of Congress at that time had a Democratic Republican majority. So Thomas Jefferson sort of brought in the first change of the political landscape. And then over the next decade or so, till probably sometime around about 1812, by that time, the Federalist Party had pretty much disappeared. It had fallen off the map, and it really was no longer an entity to be dealt with or to be part of the political landscape. And as a result, for about 2 decades, pretty much from the 1800s when Thomas Jefferson was elected, for over the course of the next couple of decades, the Democratic Republican Party existed as we basically only had one political party that had any kind of impact, any kind of I guess you would say connection to the political process. We really were a functioning one-party system for about 2 decades. And gradually, by the end of that time, and sort of by about the 1820s, the term Democratic Republican got dropped and the party was referred to as the Democratic Party. One note of history here is that the Democratic Party is said to be the oldest continual political party in the United States. Didn't know that, did you? Yeah, but the Republicans come back in. So
changing names.
Yeah, that's true. So around the late 1820s, we move into what we call the second party system. In 1828, a fellow by the name of Andrew Jackson, in my family, my mother was a Jackson, and for a long time, we ostensibly were supposedly related to Andrew Jackson. I'm related to a president when I was younger. Then I had a sibling who did a lot of, actually an aunt who did, and this was before Ancestry and things like that. She used to go down to Utah. They've got a big genealogy, thank you. Yeah, she used to go down there, and one day they came through town to visit, and she said, "I just want you to know you're not related to Andrew." I'm like, okay, good. That's not a bad thing. He wasn't exactly. But at any rate, when Andrew Jackson was elected president as a Democrat in 1828, many people within government, within society, viewed him as, I guess you would say, almost as an autocrat. They felt that he had grabbed too much power and that he was doing the opposite of what was intended when this nation was formed, in that the people would have a say, even if it was through their representatives, but that the people, that he was exerting so much power and authority in the process. It bubbled up a large opposition, and a new party was born, and that was the Whig Party. A lot of people don't realize that if they think of Whigs and they think of usually Great Britain. That's where but we actually had a Whig Party here in the United States for a few decades. And the Whig Party became strong amongst merchants and in the Northeast in particular. And one of their things was they wanted to continue the abolition of slavery, and they wanted to support abolitionists. They were supportive of that position. The opposition between the two parties focused more on personalities, though, during this era from about 1828 to 1860 than it did on what the issues were. The Whigs were a very diverse group who were united more in their opposition to what the Democratic Party had become at that time. And one of the things that the Democratic Party was known for at that time was supporting the southern states and the existence of slavery, continuing to support that in the South, supporting farmers and agriculture. That was a big part of who they were catching on to. But also during this period, conflicts within each of the parties developed as well. And slavery became a sharp division point for both parties. So there were people within each of the parties. There were proponents and there were opponents. And slavery became that sort of tilting point, that sharp point of opposition within each of the organizations. And as a result, many of the Whig Party members, as well as anti-slavery Democrats, because it didn't look like, pretty much by the late 1850s, the Whig Party had died out, and it hadn't performed real well. I think there was one presidency, I'm trying to remember who it was, that the Whig Party had obtained as elected, but it really was because of the deep divisions within its own party. And it's sort of, because it came about not based as much on positions, on issues, and those kind of more substantive aspects, but more as a slap in the face, and we got to get rid of this guy, and the opposition to Andrew Jackson, and that whole way that the Democratic Party seemed to be going. It really didn't have a very strong base from the standpoint of issues and positions and beliefs and things that they were advocating for. So as they sort of started to wither away, many of their members joined the anti-slavery Democrats, and there was a good proportion of the Democratic Party that was anti-slavery as well, and formed the Republican Party. Yeah. And one of the things that the Republican Party pledged at that time, in the late 1850s, they pledged to ban slavery in the Western territories. That had been a big, big issue, because as the geography of the nation moved west, what was a proponent of many of the politicians was, we need to let them make decisions regarding how, that territory or those new states, whether or not they're going to embrace or they're going to exclude the use of slavery. So, I think that's a part of our history that's very little known. I think we think, the Western territories and all of that was just, westward expansion and new land, new places to go, but there was a lot of politics involved in it as well. And like I said, one of the big issues was a lot of the Western, and this would surprise, but if you go back and look at the history of Oregon, we have a terrible history when it comes to the issue of slavery. And so did California, for that matter, and frankly Washington as well. But I remember when we moved here when I was 16 years old in 1969. Now I'm dating myself. When we moved here, there was still, they didn't call themselves the Klan, but there was an organization down in Southern Oregon that was effectively a Klan type organization. We moved to Grants Pass from the Reno-Sparks area. Talk about a cultural shock. My birthday's on the 4th of July, and the first went to a 4th of July parade right after we moved there, and they have the cavemen and they have a thing called the Cave Club, and I'm standing there watching the parade, and this group of half-naked men come waltzing down the street, and I'm like, holy hell, where'd you bring me? It was pretty mind-boggling. But it was, I had no clue that kind of thing had been, you grow up thinking all of that was really focused in the South. That's not the case, not at all. And in fact, in Oregon, when we achieved statehood, one of the principles in our Constitution initially was, okay, if you were a black freed slave and you were here and you were in the state at the time of statehood was established, you could stay here, but black people couldn't come in after that. So that was, really not a very pretty part of our history. Any rate, that was one of the things that really bolted the Republican Party to prominence. And in 1860, of course, who was elected president? Abraham Lincoln, right. And soon thereafter, you had the secession movement of the southern states, and the Civil War broke out. So then we move to what we call the third party system, or War and Reconstruction. And that goes from about 1860 to 1896. And I'm sorry about this. I have chronic dry mouth, and the more I talk, as my children say, Mom, that means you should shut up. Any rate, during this era, the Republicans dominated the politics in the United States, though the Democrats still remained quite competitive. In fact, in the 1864 election, they came close to winning the popular vote in the presidential election, not the electoral vote, but the popular vote. It was only by like a few percentage points. So, which was really sort of surprising to a lot of people. After the war was over, Republicans focused on rebuilding the nation, the Reconstruction movement, and they promoted rights for Black Americans as well. So that was a strong part of their platform and their existence. Strong regional identities very much dominated both Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans, of course, maintained a strong presence in the Northeast and in the Midwest. That was really their focus. The Democrats kept a stronghold in the South and in the increasing Western territories. That tended to be an area where they became, they had a stronger presence. the presidency changed hands between the mid-1870s and 1896. It changed hands with every election. With every election. And two of the five presidents during that time, elected during that time, lost the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. That didn't happen again until the year 2000, and then again in 2016. So we went from basically the late 1800s till, almost basically over 100 years before that happened again, where the presidential candidate, the person who got elected, lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote. Interestingly, during this time, the Republican Party had strong support from business and the middle class, while the Democrats had the strong support of farmers and the working class and immigrant groups. And remember, this was a time of, you had vast numbers of Germans, Irish, a lot of different European nations as well coming, immigrants coming to the country. And as they came, the Democratic Party sort of reached out and pulled those folks in. So that was one of their base of support during that time. Then we move, so remember, from the mid-1870s to 1896, every election, every 4 years, we had a different flip-flop. So then we get to the fourth party system, which goes from 1896 to 1932 and is known as sort of the business and reform era. During this time, there were many social and economic changes, particularly in the late 19th century. And we saw the emergence of a variety of protest third parties who didn't feel that either of the major parties, by then it had come down to Democrats and Republicans, that either of the major parties was effectively that they were dealing with the issues and the concerns of a bulk of society. That there were a lot of citizens out there who felt that this was, folks, pay attention. That was sort of their call. And one of these protest third parties was a party called the Populist Party, which won strong support in the South and in the West, particularly among small farmers, miners, and then urban workers, sort of your regular, your rank and file workers in the urban areas. It was quite successful in the 1892 elections. They didn't win the presidency, but what they did was win several seats in Congress. And as the decade wore on, they got smart, and they saw that what they needed, that they weren't going to be able to jump the hurdle like they thought they might. So what they did was they hooked up with the Democratic Party, and they hooked up with them in an effort to dominate the 1896 presidential election, and they were pushing forward a candidate that they thought would win the day. The Republican Party candidate was William McKinley, who was a conservative, a hardcore conservative candidate. And they were advocating for lower taxes and high tariffs on imports to promote the business of the United States rather than business coming in from outside. And they resoundingly defeated the McKinley, and the Republican Party resoundingly defeated this populist Democratic effort. And the populists had thought that by melding with one of the established parties that they would have a better shot at it, but it didn't work. And so for the next 30 years, 30 plus years, the Republican Party dominated the political landscape in the country. They elected 7 of the 9, they won the presidency 7 of the 9 times from 1896 to 1932, and they had majorities in Congress for much of that period of time as well. They pushed for greater government regulation, expanding voting rights, and creation of additional national bureaucracies. That was one of the things. And that was a very popular thing at that time. I mean, if you look at the stance, you know, one of the things when you look at the positions on issues that the different parties have taken over time, they've been very evolutionary. And, you know, there are people who would look at the Republican Party of the late 1800s into the early 1900s and to look at the Republican Party now and go, what? Not even close. But I mean, there were some issues that they're, you know, probably were consistent on, but there were others that they were highly, very, very different. And you know, that's one of the things about that we get into our heads. We think, okay, this is this party and this is this party and this is how they're. No, it's been an evolutionary process for 200 plus years. And we can't ever, I mean, and even over the last 50 years, it's been an evolutionary process. So they, you know, again, they dominated the landscape for that period of time. But then what happened, the big bullet was the Great Depression. And though the party may not have been responsible for that, or their policies may not have been responsible, the public looked at them and said, you didn't do what you should have done. You didn't take care of us. You screwed it up, folks. And what happened in 1932? FDR was elected, Democrat, again. So from 1933 to 68, we enter into what we call the fifth party system, or the system governing the Depression era, the New Deal, and the war and post-war era. The support of the Republican Party during the 30s and 40s was very, very slim. I mean, it was not very strong at all. FDR was elected in 32, as well as a solidly Democratic Congress for the first time in a few decades. He developed the New Deal as an effort to pull the country out of the Depression. What it did was a lot of things. It increased the size of government, and as a result, for the first time, government actually took an active role in the day-to-day lives of the citizens. I mean, that was really the first era where there was more. I mean, you had Social Security that came about. You had a lot of those kind of programs that were developed during that era and that period of time. And he also was very adept in expanding the base of the Democratic Party. He reached out to Jews. He reached out to the Black population. He reached out to working class. I mean, there was just a very broad variety of citizens that he and his policies and his party really, tried to pull in to become part of the base of the Democratic Party during that period of time. And he was very, very effective in maintaining that coalition within the Democratic, or his work, because obviously he died before this was all over, but his work in maintaining that coalition so that the Democratic Party was pretty dominant for the next 3 decades. So over the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. What happened was that this coalition of people within the Democratic Party, just as a lot of other things, in the late 1960s became, I guess the best way to describe it would be strained by the various conflicts erupting at the time. Civil rights, the Vietnam War, voting rights, all sorts of different issues that were perpetuating within society. And what that tended to do, this is the other thing, you know, we tend to put labels on people. And we say, okay, if somebody is a Republican, this is what their view is. If somebody who's a Democrat, this is what their view is. No, that's not always how it works out. And though you may, as a Democrat, like this issue and this aspect of the party's policies, you start looking at something else and you go, wait a minute, that's totally off base. That's not where I want to go, or I disagree with this. And it happens in both party systems. And you know, we tend to put labels on, and we tend to stick that to people, and it's not a very pretty picture, quite frankly, and it's not very realistic. But what happened in the late 1960s then is that with the disintegration of the coalition within the Democratic Party, it really opened the doors for the Republicans to come in again, and they regained the presidency. I know the Republicans had Dwight D. Eisenhower he was a Republican, and he was a solid president, but it was in a sort of a time of, you know, less turbulence in the country. He was bringing people together, post-war, all of that. But in the late 1960s, again, all of this drama that was erupting in the United States, it opened the door for the Republican Party. And what it did was effectively put folks like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, it opened the platform for them to be able to sort of have their say in how things, you know, and basically to dominate the conversation. You know, one of the things that about the time, well, shortly after Nixon was elected, we come into what we call the sixth party system from about 1972 to present. And though they gained strength, the Republicans gained strength during the Nixon and Reagan eras by diluting effectively the middle class white votes. They had policies that tended to, you know, again, this is where putting labels on people doesn't help, because if you're a middle class white voter, you can't have this idea that, okay, this is what you think about all the issues and everything. There were a lot of things in there that, okay, maybe economically they thought this way, but from the civil rights and a lot of the societal issues, they went a different direction. They took advantage of that, quite frankly. And one of the things, particularly with that Reagan did, because as a result of the New Deal and all of that, all of the policies that came after that, government had become quite big, and much bigger than it had ever been before. And one of the mantras of Ronald Reagan was that government is not the solution to our problems, but is instead the source of many of our problems. And even Bill Clinton, when he was elected, effectively, he said, this is the era of big government is over. That was one of his famous quotes. So there was this realization that was one of the, and that was really brought in by Ronald Reagan. So what we've had from about 1972 to present is what we call equal strength, a party system where they have equal strength. If you look at sort of the landscape of elections, they've flip-flopped and have gone back and forth, but each party has pretty much evolved to a position where neither party is in control. And close elections have swung control back and forth. And as a result of some of those close elections, obviously, we've had some fairly extreme partisanship that has developed. So we have shifting systems, shifting coalitions, and leaders to determine how we are governed. We have a two-party system, but that does not exclude third parties, like I said. They still have a role and have been around from the beginning. They constitute groups organized to compete against the two major parties and to typically represent social, this is important, and economic interests that they believe are not being addressed by the two main parties. And they have had some major roles in some situations. Throughout time, a lot of the members of the two parties have felt that third parties have become spoilers in different elections. One of the biggest ones in recent times was the election of 2000, where you had down in Florida, where Ralph Nader in the Green Party, he took about, I think it was 3 or 4 percentage points of the vote. But what that did was it denied Al Gore the popular vote in Florida and gave the electoral count to Bush. So there have been this sort of back and forth, but the positive part of third parties, and we should never ever, say they're not important. They are important. They can be the sources of new ideas and thus become influencers in how the two main parties, how they craft their platforms, what issues that they adopt, what things look like as far as issues and policies that they move forward. So third parties can have a big influence. And I'll wrap it up here. I know I'm getting close here, but I could go on, obviously. It's a good thing I was going to talk a little bit more about in Oregon how parties sort of play out, but here in Oregon we have 2 classifications. We have major political parties and we have minor political parties. To be a major political party, to qualify as such, a party has to have at least 5% voters eligible to vote at the last general election registered as a member of their party. So 5% of the members in the last general election registered as a member of the party. And you've probably all heard of the Independent Party, which was a big ruckus when that got formed back in the early 2000s, about 2006. And getting the name the Independent Party was a big brouhaha in the political scene, because what Oregon had done was we've done away with independents and they were not affiliated. So when this new group of people started, and the reason they were formed was in response to some things that were happening in the legislature at the time that they didn't like on both sides. So you had a group of people, Sal Peralta was one of the main people, I know Sal, Dan Meeks, I think it was. Anyway, they started this, they got the petition going to create a new party, got that created. There was a big brouhaha over the name, but the Secretary of State said, no, independent is not what our non-affiliated voters are. They're non-affiliated. So the term independent is out there. They can use it. That's how you have an independent party. And they even, that got taken all the way up to the Oregon Supreme Court, and the Oregon Supreme Court said, no, Secretary of State was right. But in 2015, they qualified to become a major party in Oregon. And at that point then, we currently have just Republicans and Democrats. Those are the only 2 major parties. The Independent Party became a major party in 2015 because they met that 5% threshold. But in 2019, they'd gone below that, and they were classified then again as a minor party. And so since then, they've been a minor party. They say a lot of the reason and rationale for that is because of motor voter. Motor voter had an impact on the number of registered voters, and that lowered their percentage. I mean, we increased the number of registered voters, huge. So that brought it down. And so since 2019, they're back in the minor party envelope. And we currently have, I think it's 7, I got it here, list. Yeah, we currently have 7 minor political parties: Constitution Party, Independent Party, Libertarian Party, the newest, the No Labels Party, Pacific Green Party, Progressive Party, and the Working Families Party. And the No Labels Party, and it took them about 2 years, close to that. You have to file a petition to become a political party in Oregon. You have to file a petition. That gets verified, then you have to gather enough signatures, and the number of signatures that you have to gather is 1.5% of the total votes cast in the last governor's election, that is the governor's election prior to the filing of the petition. Then you can go out and you have 2 years to get that 1.5% number of signatures on your petition, and if you do, then you qualify as a new political party. So we have those seven minor parties in the state, and I guess you know, it's an interesting, and there is a difference on how they operate, because the minor parties can't post candidates in the primaries. The only parties that can post candidates in the primaries are the major political parties. Nonpartisan candidates, I mean, they, you know, everybody votes for nonpartisan candidates, but they can't like put out, you know, like the Democrats do. You have 3 or 4 people running for the same position, and primary makes the selection of who the candidate's going to be for the general election. That can't occur with the minor parties. They can go through their own process of nominating a candidate, and they can place that person on the ballot in the general election. That person can be dual, you know, they can have the support of more than one party. I mean, when I ran the second time, I think I had the Working Families Party and one other party that nominated me as their candidate as well, and that can happen. But what being a minor party really relegates you to a whole different, you know, you're not part of the primary process. So
what would happen if you go to an open primary system?
Primaries to non-affiliated voters. They can't, they can choose to open it or close it. Both of them have pretty much kept with it being closed. When the independent party was a major party, it opened its primary, which meant that non-affiliated voters could participate in the primary process, but not people registered with another party. If we went to truly open primaries, that would be a whole, oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah.
I've had a chance to be reading John Meacham's new book on Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
Have you had a chance to look at it?
I haven't yet, no.
Well, I think this group would be interested. I'm still, you know, the beginning of it. But Lincoln ran against 3 candidates.
Yeah, there were 4 candidates in his, and he didn't have 50% plus in the popular vote. It was only like about 44% or something like that, 46.
Well, it's probably written here.
Yeah.
And Oregon voted for Lincoln, which really surprised
Surprising,
me.
yeah.
History.
Yeah.
And Oregon, California, then there was all those territories that weren't states, plus the North and the border states.
Yeah.
As far as the popular vote and gaining electoral votes.
Yeah.
And
Which was the key.
when he ran for, or anyone running back there in Illinois for the House of Representatives, from what I understand, it was the tradition at the time, at least among his party, which was the,
Republican Party.
well, he might have been a Whig then.
Oh, prior to that,
But in any
when he
case,
first ran for the House, yeah.
They only held office for 1 year. It was their tradition to step down and someone else take a turn.
Crazy. Yeah.
Fascinating. It's good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Really quick. You have six different eras about the president, the parties.
Parties, yeah.
I'm just curious what your thoughts would be is there a 7th era coming up, starting with the election in 2016 and 2020? Is there something?
An era of derision and I guess you would call it partisan conflict. You know, it's a good question. I think we have to sort of see how things sort of play out. I mean, if I would say, you know, the thing is that neither party has dominated the conversation for quite a period of time. It's gone back and forth. Sort of those closely contested kinds of things. My guess is the political science historians will, they'll sort of wrap something up here in the near future and probably put a label on a 7th system. I don't know what that's going to look like though. It's hard to say, but with all of the political derision out there, you know, you never know. Is that an opportunity for something else to come onto the scene? I don't know.
It'll be
Right
interesting.
here and then, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of historical questions. Was John Adams a member of a party, and why the name Whig?
I have no clue why the Whig came from Britain. It was the Whig, W-H-I-G. It's not the Whig. John Adams, no. He might have been a Federalist. I think he was a Federalist, but he wasn't a strong. He didn't like, he was George Washington's vice president. And he sort of maintained himself in a more neutral stance. But yeah, I think he was registered with the Federalist Party and ran as a Federalist. I'll go here and there. Yeah.
I have a question about minority rule. And I heard recently from John Legion that on television that the House is essentially, while the Republicans are the majority in the House, but the minority rule is, in terms of the Senate and the presidency, they're in the minority, but somehow they're steering the conversation.
Well,
So how does that happen? How does minority rule happen?
Gerrymandering.
that can come into play. Well, they have an equal voice, quite frankly, and they're something we'd like to sit there and think that because we have a divided Congress, but you have the presidency and the Senate in the same political party, that therefore, but they have a lot of power and they have a lot of strength, and it's how do I say this? Our system was set up to sort of have that ability to balance all of that out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's why it's a little unnerving to think about minority rule when a democracy should be majority rule
well,
from the people.
but when you look at it, it was designed to protect the minority voice as well, to give them a voice in the process. And you have a majority of Republicans in the House. The fact that you have the other two aspects that are Democratic control, yeah, that sort of puts a little different light on it. But in reality, it's exactly how the the founders, how they put it together, it's a more, because if you look at the Senate's a more elite chamber. They serve for 6 years. The House is every 2 years, and the idea was that it was anticipated that would change more often and more rapidly. That you had one chamber that was more steady, that was less, eruption and less of the turmoil. But you had one chamber that was totally the people's chamber, and that was it was anticipated and expected that it would go up and down, back and forth. Yeah. So sort of how I think it was planned. Not always comfortable.
It was planned to protect the white landowners.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has sort of shifted, but it still has that same.
Well, you could definitely argue that, the dominance in one chamber or the other can be very disconcerting. Yes, Kim.
One of the things when independence started in Oregon, I was doing voter registration, back a few years. And I'll tell you, everyone who filled out the voter registration card and they put independent.
They had no clue they were
no clue,
becoming
because
a
you would
member
look
of
at
a party.
them and say, I see you put independent, do you realize that is a party versus this line up here? And they go, oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Almost.
Which was the big
That was-
issue
Yeah.
by the Democrats and Republicans, and why they opposed it so strongly was because they knew that a lot of those people that were signing on the dotted line,
Yeah.
that wasn't their intent.
Well, I would say almost 100% of the people who signed for that at that
Yeah.
time.
And
at
as
least we had experience with, that's
Not
not what they wanted.
as I had a good friend of mine say, and karma came around and bit him in the butt with motor voter.
Yeah. Oh, and just saying, the League of Women Voters have been around for 103 years, and we have different parties come at us each time saying, well, you're with this party, you're with this party.
And they want to label you, yeah.
Oh, completely labeling us, and we're like, we haven't changed, you have.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so, being in something that's 103 years old, we were able to say.
There you go.
We've been supporting the same thing for 103 years.
Hey, yeah,
We're
it's like,
good.
wait, calm down, yeah.
Yeah, calm down.
Anybody else, yeah?
Yeah, you talked about how parties have flip-flopped over the decades.
Mhm.
So, I got lost in some of that. Featured a couple of, examples, maybe rights of minorities or role of.
Well, I think the
government.
Democratic Party is a great example. I mean, and the Republic, I mean, they, there was an era where, the Democratic South was strong, and even during the 50s and stuff. I mean, Dixiecrats, Strom Thurmond, all of that, I mean, it was there, and then they evolved into this, and a lot of that came as a result of people like John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, that they perpetuated and moved the party into this organization that protected and promoted the rights of a broad spectrum of people. And so, and the Republican Party, I mean, it's had the same kinds of things. Early on it was a staunch supporter of anti-slavery and all of that. And not that it ever became a non-supporter, or a supporter of slavery at all, but, a lot of their positions on societal issues have changed over time. Yeah. Up here and then.
Yeah, two things really.
And I know that there's probably a lot more that we can get into, but go on forever.
One would be, there's talk about increasing the number in the House of Representatives to represent the increase in population. Wonder if you had any reflection on that. And then, that states are now slowly trying to avoid the results of the Electoral College thing by making it statewide, the popular vote statewide would something, I'm not sure how to articulate, you know what I'm talking about.
Well,
if the state, if the majority of people in the state vote one way, that's how they will go,
Right.
rather than going by the electoral.
Right.
Well, but, okay, yeah, that, I mean, each state has the ability to determine how their electoral votes, they have the same number, they don't get to change, their electoral votes are determined by population. Like the next election here in Oregon, presidential election, Oregon now has 6 congressional districts and 2, so we'll have 8 electoral votes as versus 7. So that gets changed, but how you determine how those electoral votes are cast, states like Oregon, what we do, it's majority. I mean, whoever wins the popular vote in the state, all of those go. Some states divide them by,
Percentages.
by percentages, yeah.
So there's just more and more states are doing it like Oregon, I think.
Could be, I don't know for sure. Go back here and then come back to.
I've got my.
Oh, did you have another question? No,
Well, the increase
Oh,
in the House of Representatives.
that's not gonna happen.
Okay.
No.
Then
It's
we'll
gonna
only
stay,
get
it's
this
gonna
power.
pretty much, it's gonna stay at 435. I don't see it changing, yeah.
Now, there's a movement in that when there is the popular votes for one particular state.
The National
will-
Popular Vote
Right,
Act, yeah.
and that, so do you see that, I know a lot of states have, but I don't know how many, do you see that happening?
That we would go on a national basis, do away with the electoral college?
Well, it doesn't, well, it kind of
It will
overrides the election.
Yeah, I know, enough states adopt the National Popular Vote, Act, then you would effectively have the popular vote maintaining. It's hard to say, I mean, I think that there's been some momentum in that direction, but I think in the last couple of years, that momentum has sort of died off. It hasn't been as robust as it was for about 8 years, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the Senate, because at the time that the country was founded, my understanding was the Senate was really meant to make sure that there was representation for the smaller states. Can everyone?
Well, it was equal, yeah,
Right.
the representation there was equal too.
Right, But at
everybody
one-
had the same number,
Right,
yeah.
and at one point, I took a look at the population of the 13 original states. The largest state was about 7 times more populous than the smallest state. Now we have California at about 40 million or over 40 million, and Wyoming at about 700,000 or 800,000. So the largest state has about 40 times as much population as the smallest state, and so the smallest states really get outsized representation in the Senate. Has there ever been?
Well,
or is
the way it was set up purposefully, so that one chamber was related to population, and everybody had to have at least one representative.
And it made sense back then.
And then the other side was that to equal it out was exactly that. You would have the same equal number of representatives in the Senate. I don't see that that's gonna change. No, I think that's, and it's because each house it's not like they're independent. I mean, the legislative process is such that it has to work together. I mean, for things to get done, they have to, it's not like one chamber passes a piece of legislation and that's it. No, it doesn't work that way. They have to work together to get things done, so. Back there and then there.
Oh, okay. Oh, I know what I wanted to, I wanted to make a statement. So, for the people, I mean, our government is based on what we want, and I feel our voices, regardless of what party you may be with, is not being heard. Because when you look at the polls that go out, and they say that 76% of the American population wants abortions, it's almost like they're not listening. Somebody up there, they're not, how do we get our voices heard? How do we say enough is enough, and that?
Well, that, not every, let me back this up, and that's a good issue, but remember, there are states, and there's state governments, and there's national government. When something becomes a national issue, like abortion did as a result of Roe v. Wade, then it is determined at the national level. And when the Supreme Court made their more recent decision that effectively gave back to the states the ability to make decisions in that era, in that arena, then it gave back to the states that ability. And the courts, see, as I tell my students all the time, one thing that we don't appreciate, the common citizen, is the power of the courts. Period, plain and simple. And that's where a lot of this comes into play, is their interpretation of the Constitution and constitutional law and application of it. And it ebbs and flows, and it has changed over time. I mean, Roe v. Wade abortion issue is a classic example of that. And, it's, yeah.
Well, when you start stacking the courts.
Well, that's,
and
and that's, that's one of here in Oregon, our judges and our justices in the appellate courts are elected. At the national level, they are appointed.
Okay.
And that is a key issue, and a very valid one.
Another problem that I see.
And it's not gonna change anytime in the near future, though.
I think with the young people coming up and their absolute disgust with both parties, I think it will change. Maybe we won't be alive to see it, but change is coming.
Well,
And I think
there were a greater portion of
What do
young.
you see in your students?
Yes. I didn't mean to cut you off. You can go ahead and finish your statement.
Well, I just wanted to say, with the judges that are elected, I find that not knowing what party that they are affiliated with is not fair to the voter.
Well,
It's
those
not.
are nonpartisan positions. That's how they're classified, and you're not gonna change
I know
them.
that
In this state, not all states. Wisconsin, well, you knew who they were, I think they were, yeah. But, no, I know, when my husband's position he was the district attorney here for 24 years.
But I wanted to.
It's a nonpartisan position. A lot of people didn't know what his party affiliation was until he ran for Congress in 1996. And he ran as a Democrat, and people were like, "You're a Democrat?" It was like, oh my God. That's just one of those things.
Well, I just believe that in my opinion,
I gotcha.
anyway,
I got it.
anyway, that the
Yeah.
non-political, non-partisan you still bring your views and your beliefs to your position.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important for people to know what those